She thought he was just another stray. But one stormy night, she found the tattoo behind his ear, and everything changed. Who was this mysterious German shepherd, and what heartbreaking secret did his silence hide? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The sky hung low and gray, the rain falling in a soft, relentless rhythm that soaked through the old wool of Evelyn's coat as she trudged toward the rusted gate at the edge of her property. The narrow path beneath her boots had turned to mud, but she walked it anyway, the same way she had every day for the past month, her eyes scanning the mist-covered tree line where the shadows seemed to breathe. And then, as if summoned by the memory of his absence, he appeared again, a dark, silent figure half concealed by the brambles, his amber eyes glowing faintly through the drizzle. The German shepherd stood there with that same rigid posture, his head held high despite the gaunt lines of his body and the faint tremble in his legs. His ribs pressed against his rain-matted fur, his ears flicking at the faintest sound, every inch of him a portrait of practiced stillness and calculated distance. He wasn't like the other strays she'd seen in her time. There was no frantic searching in his eyes, no desperate whimpers or mindless pacing. He simply watched, patient and composed, as if assessing her intentions with the quiet precision of someone who had learned the hard way that trust was a dangerous thing. Evelyn knelt near the gate despite the cold mud seeping through her pants, setting down a small metal bowl of fresh water and a tin plate of leftover roast she'd saved just for him. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her hands trembling slightly, not from the chill but from something deeper, something that pulled at a part of her heart she'd long tried to quiet. She spoke softly, her voice roughened by years and sorrow. "Easy there, soldier. Nobody's asking you to come in, not before you are ready." The words slipped out before she even realized it. Soldier. And as she said it, she saw the faintest flicker in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle lift of his ears as if the word itself held weight and meaning buried somewhere deep beneath the hardened shell of his worn exterior. The rain continued to fall, thin streams running down the battered iron of the gate, but neither of them moved for a long moment, locked in a silent exchange older than language. And then, as if some unseen wall between them had cracked just slightly, he took one cautious step forward, his paws pressing into the wet earth with practiced quiet, his nose lifting toward the scent of food. But even as he drew closer, his eyes never left hers, that haunted intelligence shining through the rain like a silent warning. He had seen things no creature should have to endure, and trust, if it ever came, would be earned through patience and grace alone. Evelyn didn't move, didn't push. She simply sat there in the rain, watching the stranger at the gate with a kind of reverence, her heart aching with the unspoken recognition that sometimes the most wounded souls wear their strength not in scars, but in the disciplined refusal to fall apart. The days slipped by like pages in a forgotten journal, each one marked by the quiet ritual that unfolded beneath the fading light of every evening. Evelyn found herself looking forward to those moments more than she cared to admit, her old boots finding the familiar muddy path long before the sun dipped below the horizon. The German shepherd was always there now, a sentinel waiting just beyond the gate, his dark silhouette carved against the dusky sky, those keen eyes following her every step as if calculating her intent with the precision of a soldier assessing a battlefield. He no longer darted away at her approach. Instead, he lingered after his meal, his body perfectly still, except for the faintest flicks of his tail, a restrained gesture of cautious acceptance. Evelyn took to sitting near the gate after placing his food, her legs crossed beneath her, a steaming mug of chamomile tea held between weathered hands more for comfort than warmth. She spoke to him then, her voice low and rhythmic, the words falling into the familiar cadence she hadn't used since the days spent pacing medical tents in the thick of battlefields far from home. "Steady, soldier. Eyes up, back straight," she would murmur. And every time she called him soldier, those ears would twitch, his head tilting ever so slightly, as if the words stirred some distant memory locked away beneath years of hardship. She told him about the boys she'd patched up overseas, the long nights filled with pain and fear, and the endless waiting for the sound of boots on gravel signaling a return or a loss. And through it all, the shepherd never barked, never whimpered, never made a sound. He sat there, tall and proud, posture rigid, listening with a stillness that spoke louder than words, his presence a quiet reassurance that in the midst of broken things, there was still something unshaken. It struck Evelyn deeply, that kind of dignity in suffering, the refusal to fall apart even when the weight of the world pressed down hard. It was a look she had seen before in the eyes of young soldiers barely old enough to understand what they were fighting for. A look that said they had carried burdens far too heavy for their years. And every time she looked into his eyes, she felt the pull of something familiar, something buried deep in the place where duty and grief intertwined. Slowly, the space between them began to close. One evening, as the sky burned orange and the chill of autumn crept into the air, the shepherd took a bold step forward and sat just within reach, his flank barely brushing against her knee. He didn't look at her directly, but his presence was an unspoken acceptance, a silent answer to the countless nights spent building a bond with nothing but patience and gentle words. Evelyn reached out, her fingertips grazing his damp fur for the first time, and though he tensed, he didn't pull away. That small moment felt like a victory greater than any medal she had ever pinned to a uniform. And as the stars broke through the darkening sky, Evelyn found herself whispering a promise she hadn't realized had been forming all along. "We'll figure out where you came from, soldier. One way or another, we'll bring you home." The storm came in fast and unforgiving, a brutal wall of wind and rain that swallowed the horizon and turned the familiar quiet of Evelyn's property into a battlefield of crashing thunder and jagged bolts of lightning that split the sky in blinding flashes. The air felt charged, thick with the raw electricity of nature's fury, and as the storm raged against the creaking porch, Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and peered out into the tempest, her heart instinctively searching for the dark shape she knew would be braving it alone. Through the sheets of rain, she caught sight of him, the proud silhouette of the shepherd standing just beyond the gate, his head low against the driving wind, his body rigid with a defiance that barely masked the tremble running through his frame. He stood there as if holding the line against an enemy force, his ears pinned back, his eyes glinting every time lightning split the sky. But even the bravest soldier had his breaking point. When the thunder rolled again with a ferocity that shook the ground, he finally gave in to the battle he could not win, his legs carrying him forward in a desperate, almost reluctant surrender. With a sudden burst of speed, he crossed the line he had held for so long, his powerful form darting through the open gate and up onto the porch, his soaked body collapsing into the corner just beneath the old wooden swing. Evelyn found him there, curled tight against the cold boards, his sides heaving, his entire frame shuddering with the violence of fear he could no longer control. His pride hadn't vanished. It was there in the way he tried to keep his head high, his teeth clenched against the instinct to cry out. But his body betrayed him, the tremors refusing to subside. Without a second thought, Evelyn grabbed the thick wool blanket from her chair and knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the wet wood as she gently draped the blanket over his trembling form. She didn't speak, didn't try to coax him or reassure him with hollow comforts. She simply sat with him, her hand resting firmly against his shaking shoulders, her presence steady and unmoving as the storm continued to rage around them. Time seemed to stretch and fold into itself in that moment, the storm outside becoming a distant echo to the quiet bond forged beneath that battered porch roof. His breathing slowed gradually, each ragged inhale becoming a little steadier as the warmth of the blanket and the calm weight of her hand grounded him. And when the storm finally began to ebb, the rain softening to a gentle whisper against the roof, Evelyn felt the tension leave his body. He shifted closer, just slightly, enough for his head to rest against her knee, and in that simple gesture, years of distance collapsed into a single, silent truth. Trust, earned through nothing but patience and shared hardship, had finally crossed the line neither of them had dared to step over before. And under the faint glow of the porch light, as the storm drifted into memory, Evelyn knew that from this night on, he wasn't just a visitor at her gate. He was home. The first fragile light of dawn broke through the dissipating storm clouds, casting pale streaks of gold across the rain-slicked boards of the porch where the shepherd slept in exhausted stillness. The storm had stolen every ounce of his strength, and now he lay curled beneath the faded wool blanket, his powerful chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. Evelyn sat beside him, the remnants of the long night carved deep into her tired eyes, her hand resting gently against his flank as she watched him sleep. The storm had washed away more than the dirt clinging to his fur. It had revealed something fragile, something raw, a soul too long burdened by battles fought in silence. Her fingers moved absently through his damp coat, her touch light and careful, tracing the hardened muscles beneath as if reading a history written not in words but in scars. When her hand moved behind his ear, she felt it, a faint ridge of raised skin that didn't belong. Her breath caught in her throat as she pushed the fur aside, her heart stuttering in her chest. And there it was, barely visible against the pale skin hidden beneath layers of thick fur, a faded tattoo, the ink blurred with time, but unmistakable. A sequence of letters and numbers etched in a code she hadn't seen in years, but one she could never forget. It was a military eye, the kind given only to the most elite K-9 units. Dogs trained for missions too dangerous to be recorded, their existence classified, their service known only to a select few. Her vision blurred as she leaned closer, her fingers trembling now as she traced the edges of that mark, the chill of long-buried memories rushing through her veins like ice water. She had seen this before during her years tending to wounded soldiers in the dust and chaos of forgotten battlefields, patching up boys too young to carry the weight of the horrors they'd seen, and standing quietly by when handlers mourned dogs they called brothers. Those numbers meant this dog wasn't just a survivor. He was a soldier, a veteran of wars waged in shadows. Evelyn's mind raced as she pieced it together, every moment of the past weeks falling into place. The way he sat so still, the way his ears flicked at familiar commands, the haunted look in his eyes that spoke of loss and loyalty all at once. He wasn't a stray who'd wandered onto her land by accident. He had been searching, driven by a purpose that had outlasted whatever mission he'd been torn from. As the early morning light grew stronger and the first birds began to stir, Evelyn sat back on her heels, her hand resting gently against his neck. Her voice came soft and raw, almost a whisper against the breaking dawn. "You're not lost, are you, soldier? You're waiting for someone to bring you home." And in that moment, Evelyn knew this wasn't the end of a sad story about a stray dog who'd found refuge on a quiet porch. This was the beginning of a journey, a mission long delayed but not yet finished. And she, a nurse who had patched up broken warriors and watched too many of them slip away, wasn't about to let this one be forgotten. The days that followed blurred into sleepless nights and long hours hunched over her aging laptop, the soft glow of the screen painting Evelyn's lined face in pale light as she dove headfirst into a past she'd spent years trying to forget. Her fingers trembled as they moved over faded photographs and military records, each click of the mouse peeling back layers of a story buried under the weight of classified files and silent grief. She called in favors she hadn't touched in decades, her voice cracking through phone lines that had long gone cold, reaching out to men and women who had shared the same bus-choked air and the same sleepless nights on foreign soil. One by one they answered, their voices brittle with the years, but their memories razor-sharp when it came to the things that mattered. And every thread she followed circled back to the same dark corner of history, a mission that had never made the news, a team that had disappeared into the blacked-out lines of military reports. Operation Silent Echo, a mission so deeply classified that even whispers about it felt dangerous. It was there, buried in the footnotes and forgotten casualty lists, that she found the code again, tied to a K-9 operative codenamed Valor, a German shepherd trained for reconnaissance and extraction, assigned to a handler known only as Sergeant Caleb Vance. Both had been listed as missing in action after a mission gone wrong deep behind enemy lines, the details so obscured by redacted reports that even those who were there spoke of it in fractured memories and unfinished sentences. But Evelyn remembered that mission all too well. She had been stationed at a forward operating base when the fragmented reports came through. An ambush, radio silence, and then nothing. The unit had been presumed lost, the survivors too few and too broken to fill in the blanks. Yet somehow, against all odds, Valor had made it home, or at least as close to home as he could find, And if Valor was alive, it raised a question that clawed at her chest with every passing hour. What had happened to Sergeant Vance? Had he fallen in that distant land, or had he too survived, carrying the same ghost that haunted this dog's every step? Evelyn sat back in her chair, her tired eyes falling to the shepherd sleeping at her feet, his breathing steady, but his dreams restless, paws twitching against the floor as if he were still running through enemy terrain. Her heart ached with the weight of it all, the pieces falling into place with brutal clarity. This wasn't just a case of a lost dog finding a kind stranger. This was the unfinished end of a soldier's story, a thread left dangling in the harsh winds of forgotten battles. And Evelyn Hart, retired nurse and caretaker of too many broken souls, wasn't about to let this one end in silence. She reached for her phone again, her voice steady as she made the call that would set everything in motion. "We need to find Caleb Vance," she said, her fingers tightening against the receiver, her gaze never leaving the sleeping soldier at her feet. "We owe them that much." The fire crackled softly, its warm glow flickering across the worn walls of Evelyn's small living room as the storm outside faded into a distant memory. The old rocking chair creaked gently beneath her weight as she sat with a faded field manual open in her lap, the brittle pages trembling slightly in her hands. At her feet, the shepherd, Valor, she had begun to call him without even realizing, lay stretched across the tattered rug, his breathing deep and steady. Yet even in his rest, his body never fully relaxed. His ears twitched at every subtle shift of the wind, his paws moving faintly as if they still remembered the terrain of distant battlefields. Evelyn's eyes softened as she looked down at him, a lump rising in her throat as old ghosts stirred in the corners of her mind. She remembered the boys she'd tended to under the harsh lights of makeshift medical tents, their faces still smooth with youth, but their eyes aged far beyond their years, carrying the weight of horrors they would never fully speak aloud. And now, looking at Valor, she saw that same look etched into the depths of his amber gaze, a silent grief wrapped in the discipline of a soldier who had learned to endure without complaint. Almost without thinking, she began to read from the manual, Wifimimu, her voice low and steady, the words rolling off her tongue like a prayer long forgotten. Sit, stay, eyes forward, ready on command. At first it felt foolish, a relic of the past that had no place in the quiet of her home. But as she spoke, something remarkable happened. Valor's ears lifted, his head turning slightly toward her, his eyes sharpening with a clarity that hadn't been there before. She continued, flipping through the pages, calling out the old commands with the exact cadence she'd heard so many times on the training fields and in the shadows of war zones. Advance, hold position, stand down. With each familiar phrase, Valor responded as if a forgotten switch had been flipped within him. He sat up straight, his body falling naturally into the postures etched into his muscle memory by years of disciplined training. His chest puffed out, his head held high, and for a brief moment, the years of wandering melted away, and the warrior he once was stood proudly before her. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she watched him, her heart breaking and mending all at once. "That's right, soldier," she whispered through the tightness in her throat. "You remember? You were never just a stray. You were always a fighter." And as the firelight danced across his proud silhouette, Evelyn realized that she wasn't just rekindling his memories. She was reigniting her own sense of purpose. In helping him remember who he was, she was remembering who she had been too. A healer, a protector, someone who stood in the gap when the world felt like it was falling apart. And she made herself a silent promise that night by the fire. She would not let this soldier's story end forgotten. Together they would find the missing piece of his past, and maybe, just maybe, bring them both the peace they had spent so long searching for. The day dawned colder than most, a biting wind cutting through the thin fabric of Evelyn's coat as she stood at the entrance to the military base she hadn't set foot on in over a decade. But none of that mattered now. At her side, Valor walked with the proud, purposeful stride of a soldier who had never forgotten his duty, his head held high, his steps firm against the concrete underfoot. The guards at the gate barely questioned her presence once their eyes fell on the tattoo visible beneath the shepherd's ear and the intensity of his unwavering gaze. They escorted her straight to the commander's office, a room that smelled faintly of old leather and years of secrets buried beneath polished floors and heavy blinds drawn tight against the morning sun. Commander Briggs stood behind his desk, his broad shoulders tense beneath the crisp fabric of his uniform, his sharp eyes locking onto the tattoo the moment Evelyn brushed aside the fur behind Valor's ear. His jaw tightened, a shadow passing over his features as she recounted the story, how Valor had appeared out of nowhere, how he bore the mark of a lost soldier, how he responded to commands like he'd only left the battlefield yesterday. Briggs listened without interruption, his face a hard mask forged by years of carrying burdens too heavy for one man. But when Evelyn mentioned the name Caleb Vance, something cracked behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition that couldn't be hidden. He turned away, pacing the room with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as if the weight of memory had become too heavy to bear standing still. Operation Silent Echo, he muttered at last, his voice low, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That mission, he paused, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly before he faced her again. They told us Vance was lost, that he went down with his team behind enemy lines. But there were rumors, unofficial reports that someone matching his description made it out, refused extraction, went completely off-grid. Evelyn's heart clenched painfully against her ribs. She knelt beside Valor, her hand pressing gently against his chest to calm the growing tension in his frame as the realization settled between them. He survived, didn't he? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Briggs nodded grimly. Survived and disappeared. Couldn't face the guilt, the shame of leaving his partner behind. We thought the dog was gone too. But now, seeing him here, his voice trailed off, heavy with regret. Evelyn stood, her back straight, despite the weight pressing down on her, her eyes filled with a determined fire. Then we're going to find him, she said firmly, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Briggs didn't argue. He simply moved to a locked cabinet, retrieved a thin, dusty file, and handed it over. This is everything we have. It's not much, but it's a start. As she tucked the file under her arm and turned to leave, Valor pressed close to her side, his posture tall, his eyes bright with something that hadn't been there before. Hope. And in that quiet, powerful moment, Evelyn knew the mission was far from over. They had found the final piece of the puzzle. Now it was time to bring the lost soldier home. The days that followed became a blur of forgotten streets and faded memories. Evelyn driving through cities where the shine of downtown lights never reached the crumbling edges of forgotten neighborhoods. The file from Commander Briggs sat on the passenger seat, its contents a roadmap of dead ends and faint echoes of a man who had once worn his uniform like armor, but now seemed to hide beneath layers of guilt and silence. Valor rode in the back seat, his eyes scanning the world beyond the window with the sharp awarenesses of a soldier always on alert. His ears flicking at every distant sound, his muscles tensing when they pulled into places where the air smelled of despair and broken promises. They started at the veterans' shelters, dimly lit rooms filled with men whose faces wore the same hollow expression Evelyn had seen too often in the recovery tents overseas. Men who had survived battles but never escaped them. She moved quietly among them, her voice low, her questions careful, showing the faded photo of Caleb Vance from his last known service record. Most shook their heads with vacant eyes, but some looked away too quickly, their silence speaking louder than words. And Valor, he searched like his very soul depended on it. His nose stayed close to the ground, his body tense and focused, his every step purposeful as if following a trail Evelyn couldn't see. They checked rundown motels with flickering vacancy signs, places where the air was thick with smoke and the weight of untold stories. At every stop, Valor moved ahead, pushing through doorways and alleys with a determination that refused to waver. And though the trail was faint, every now and then he would pause, his body going perfectly still, his nose lifted as if the scent of the man he searched for still lingered faintly in the air, like a forgotten prayer. Evelyn followed him through rain-slicked alleyways and beneath the overpasses where the forgotten gathered around burning barrels for warmth. She sat for hours in soup kitchens, listening to fragments of conversations, watching Valor work the crowd, his gaze meeting the eyes of every drifter, every lost soldier who had given up hope that anyone was still looking for them. And even when the days turned into nights and exhaustion clawed at her bones, Evelyn pressed on because she had promised Valor and herself that she wouldn't let this end in a story of regret. Somewhere out there, Caleb Vance was breathing the same air, carrying the same weight of memory, and she believed with everything she had left that Valor would be the one to find him. With every dawn that broke across the cracked windows of forgotten places, they began again, the mission as clear as it had ever been. And as Evelyn placed her hand gently on Valor's head before each search, she whispered the same words she had spoken to countless wounded souls before him. "We're close, soldier. I can feel it. Just lead me there." And Valor, with the unshakable loyalty of a warrior answering his final call, pressed forward into the unknown. The horizon was barely a pale smudge against the black remnants of night as Evelyn guided the car through the winding streets toward the waterfront, the sky above heavy with the weight of an unspoken promise. A low fog clung to the ground, curling around the empty streets like a living thing, swallowing sound and sight alike. The docks stretched out ahead, silhouetted against the faintest hint of morning light, their wooden beams creaking with every lazy lap of the water. Evelyn's heart felt heavier with each step she took toward the shoreline, her breath hitching against the chill that cut through her coat. And then, through the swirling mist, she saw him. A lone figure hunched on a splintered bench at the edge of the docks, shoulders rounded against the cold. His face turned toward the endless stretch of fog-covered water, as if waiting for a salvation that had long since stopped coming. His hair was longer now, streaked with gray and wild from neglect, his cheeks hollow, his skin pale beneath the bruising shadows under his eyes. But even in the broken posture and lost expression, Evelyn recognized the haunted outline of Sergeant Caleb Vance. Before she could call out, before any word left her lips, Valor broke free from her side with a sudden, powerful burst of movement, his paws pounding against the damp wooden planks as he charged forward, his body a blur of purpose and memory unleashed. Caleb turned at the sound, his tired eyes widening in disbelief as the figure of his lost companion materialized from the mist like a ghost come home. Valor leapt onto the bench beside him without hesitation, his massive paws landing heavily against Caleb's lap, his chest pressed to the man's heart as if trying to fill the hollow space that had been carved out there for so many years. The dam broke then, not with words but with a raw, aching flood of emotion that poured from both man and animal. Caleb's arms wrapped around Valor's powerful frame, his hands gripping fistfuls of damp fur as tears spilled unchecked down his weathered cheeks. His head bowed against Valor's neck, his broken voice repeating the same cracked apology over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry." And Valor, with the loyalty of a heart that had never given up the search, answered only with soft, joyful whines, his body pressed so tightly against Caleb's, it seemed impossible to separate them again. Evelyn stood back from it all, her arms crossed against the chill, her throat tight with the weight of a moment she'd fought so hard to make real. She watched them, the broken man and the warrior dog who had refused to stop looking for him, and felt her own tears slip silently down her cheeks. There was beauty in their pain, in the undeniable truth that love and loyalty, no matter how long buried, could still find their way home. And as the sun finally broke through the horizon, spilling soft light across the fog-draped docks, Evelyn knew she had just witnessed a reunion forged not by fate, but by the unbreakable bond of two soldiers who had never stopped believing in each other, even when the world tried to make them forget. The days grew longer and softer, the bitter winds of winter giving way to the tender warmth of spring as life slowly returned to the quiet corners of Evelyn's home. The old porch that had once sheltered a trembling, rain-soaked shepherd now echoed with the steady rhythm of two sets of footsteps, one human, one canine, walking side by side through the garden paths and along the rolling hills that stretched beyond the property line. Caleb Vance stood taller with each passing day, the hollowness that had etched itself into his face now replaced by color and quiet strength, his shoulders no longer burdened by the unbearable weight of guilt. And Valor, his loyal companion, walked with a renewed pride, his steps light, his eyes bright with the contentment of a soldier finally reunited with his brother in arms. Evelyn watched them from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. a knowing smile playing on her lips as she witnessed a healing that went deeper than wounds ever could. The two of them moved through their shared days as if no time had passed at all, the connection between them seamless and unspoken, forged long ago on distant battlegrounds and tempered by years of searching through silence and sorrow. Caleb found his voice again in the simple rituals of daily life, fixing the broken fence out back, tending to the stubborn roses Evelyn had all but given up on, sitting under the porch at night with a guitar in his lap, his fingers slowly remembering how to coax songs from worn strings while Valor lay curled at his feet, his ears twitching to the familiar melodies. And as the weeks slipped into months, the heavy shadows that had once clouded Caleb's eyes lifted, replaced by a quiet peace that settled over him like a long-lost friend. It was in the smallest moments that Evelyn saw it most clearly. The way Caleb reached out to rest his hand gently on Valor's head as they sat watching the sun dip below the horizon. The way Valor leaned into the touch with the ease of a soul that had finally come home. Together they found a rhythm that spoke of redemption, of battles faced and survived, of a bond that had never truly broken despite time and distance trying to wear it away. And as the final blooms of spring gave way to the full warmth of summer, Evelyn sat once more on that old porch swing, her heart full with the knowledge that her final mission had been completed not with grand gestures or medals, but with patience, compassion, and the steadfast belief that even the most broken hearts can find their way back to where they belong. Watching the man and his dog disappear down the dirt path toward the fields beyond, their silhouettes framed by golden sunlight, she breathed in the sweet air of peace and whispered to herself with a bittersweet smile, "Some stories don't end. They just come home." And in that moment, beneath the wide open sky, Evelyn knew that the echoes of war had finally fallen silent, replaced by the soft, steady footsteps of two soldiers walking forward, together, right where they were always meant to be.